Hello, ideaXme listeners. Anna Guzman, Space Ambassador here. For today's show, I interviewed Caley Burke, an aerospace engineer working at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We'll be chatting about the work she does for the Launch Services program over at NASA and quite a bit about rockets. Hope you enjoy this episode. Caley, so exciting to talk to you today. Finally, we keep going back and forth, and you've been a busy gal, I've been a busy gal. So happy that you can come on our show today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me. So yeah, just another day in Florida, working on trajectories from my home.
Yeah, you guys have been keeping pretty busy this year with a lot of launches.
We have. It's been a pretty exciting year here at Kennedy Space Center. We have back in May, we launched astronauts with the Demo 2 mission with SpaceX. And so it was great after almost 9 years to get them launching from Florida again, from US soil. And then also the March 2020 launch is a pretty big one that happened in July. So got that 26-month between launch periods. So it was good to get those two essential missions up in space.
So let's tell the audience, you are what they call a rocket scientist.
Yes, that's the quickest shortcut to describe my job.
So tell me, like, you're out at a restaurant, you're in an elevator, and people ask you, who are you? Do you really say, I'm a rocket scientist?
So I have. It kind of depends. You know, sometimes it's fun to say it almost ironically, or else if somebody's, I mean, it's not ironic, it's the truth, but to just kind of be flip about it, depends on kind of the conversational mood I'm in. But, you know, often I'll just say I'm an aerospace engineer and, you know, see what kind of level of detail they want to get into. But sometimes, you know, it's just a quick shortcut to be like, I'm a rocket scientist and I really do work on rockets, and I'm an engineer who's making sure the spacecraft gets the right time and place up in space.
So set this up for us. Explain to our audience a little bit. You're at Kennedy Space Center and you work for the Launch Services program. So tell our audience a little bit of how you go about doing your job day to day and what your program is in charge of.
Yeah, so what our program does, the Launch Services program, so we are a NASA program, and the work that we do is on the rockets that launch the NASA robotic and NOAA spacecraft. And so these are just the traditional satellites you think of, or the rovers that are going to Mars or to explore their planets, the telescopes that we launch up into space, and then with the NOAA, the weather satellites. And so those satellites and those spacecraft have really amazing science and jobs that they're doing, but they can't do it here on Earth. They have to get to space to do it. And so what our job is to match them up with the appropriate rocket, and the rocket is a commercial one that I work with on Launch Services program. They're owned by companies, they're operated by companies, not NASA. Instead, we partner with them and contract for them to the service of getting them to space. And so there's a lot of elements. So I'm an aerospace engineer. I have degrees from Purdue University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology in aerospace engineering. So that's where I'm the very straight rocket scientist, where I'm an aerospace engineer. Mm-hmm. But we have people with all kinds of fields that are in it. So when we talk about contracts, you have to have people, lawyers involved, people who are really familiar with the details of contracting, business, because NASA is when we're doing this and we're contracting these services, we want to be responsible with the taxpayers' money as much as possible. So we have a contract with multiple rockets on it. That is the most common one we'll use. We do have other ways we'll do it, contract them. And we'll kind of basically put out a request and say, hey, we have this mission, it's going to this place, and here are the requirements. You know, launch vehicle companies that we've worked with that are here in the US, you know, what can you do? And they'll put together a proposal, we'll review it, we'll look at the cost, but we'll also look at, you know, our past experience with the company, how on schedule they've been, how good a job they've been at doing the requirements. So that's where we say it's not just looking at the best cost, we're looking for the best value, because the spacecraft that we launch are usually, you know, multiple times the cost of the rocket. So saving a little bit of money on the rocket doesn't make sense if it endangers your really expensive spacecraft. So, but you know, there's times when a spacecraft, a rocket that costs less can do the job just as well, or you know, and sometimes better. It has huge variations. You know, our spacecraft they're just unique, you know, very unique. They have different requirements, and so we have to take all these into account. And so that's really kind of where the business side will come into point of view of keeping us on schedule, and looking at the money. And you know, a big part of our job is we're working with these rocket companies, and we spend a lot of time getting to know the rockets. We have people who live in the places where the rockets are developed, and so their office is actually sometimes at the rocket factories, not at NASA. And the rest of us that most of us are at Kennedy Space Center, the majority of us are here, but we'll review, you know, blueprints and documents and all kinds of things to really get to know them. Not as well as the rocket company, but very well. And so it's a wonderful resource in us, and that we see these rockets from all these different companies because they can't share data across to one another. They, you know, have business reasons for keeping their stuff there, but we get to look at them. And so we don't share things, but we can use our knowledge of something we've learned from one rocket or a rocket 20 years ago and apply it to a problem today. So we're there as NASA's rocket experts.
So do you guys play, I guess it would be the equivalent of like liaison or usher between the people in charge of the payload or the satellite or the spacecraft that needs to go up into space and the folks that build the rockets and run the rockets? Would that be an accurate?
Yes, the way that most of our contracts are written, they're in between. So we're kind of there guiding the conversations, because we'll also, just like we're talking with the rocket companies, when a spacecraft comes on board, you know, we have some of us, and so because I'm a trajectory analyst, so my job is to look at the path the rocket's going to take. And so I'm one of the people who's very obsessed with, okay, spacecraft, where are you going? Where do you want to end up? And so sometimes that destination they want the rocket to take them is the final destination, where they're going to be permanently in orbit. And sometimes it's just a stop on the way. But we work with them, get to know that, and help them know years ahead of time, well, what are the potential rockets they could use? And then as they get closer and their proposals get funded by NASA, then we kind of come along with that. They say, okay, here's money to go build your spacecraft, and here's the launch services program. They're going to take care of the rocket for you. So we'll work with them. And
do some of these payloads and spacecrafts, are they all American, or do you guys deal internationally as well?
Yeah, we do internationally. So NASA has a lot of international partners, particularly on our spacecraft side. So sometimes what it is it's an American payload, and there are instruments that are created by foreign countries. But sometimes the primary builder of the spacecraft is actually from another country. Like we have Sentinel-6A, and so France is the one who is actually building that one. And so, you know, the European Space Agency is a frequent partner. So, you know, we work with the Japanese. I mean, really, we work with a lot of the space agencies around the world. Not all, but many of them. It's, you know, it's wonderful thing about science. It's incredibly collaborative. You know, countries, there's a lot to benefit from partnering where we can. So I personally haven't worked on a mission where there's been strong international, at my level, cooperation. You know, the payloads I've worked on, maybe somebody else on NASA is working with somebody, a national partner. So, but some of my coworkers do. So some of them, times they get to travel to other countries. You know, sometimes we also work on missions in an advisory capacity where it is either a NASA spacecraft or a foreign spacecraft with a NASA instrument, and it's going on a foreign rocket. So there's one, NISAR, from the Jet Propulsion Lab, is launching on an Indian rocket, on an Indian spacecraft. It's a big instrument we have. So.
And it's not only at Kennedy Space Center where your program handles launches, right? There's other areas that NASA uses depending where they want to get to, other launch pads?
Yeah, so we use multiple launch sites. So the program is based at Kennedy Space Center, and about 60% of the spacecraft that we work with do launch out of Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, which are, you know, on this big property that we kind of sometimes will treat as one entity. They're right next door. but we have many of them will also launch from Vandenberg in California. So that's a little bit north of LA. Sometimes we've gone from Wallops, which is in Virginia. We've had launches from Alaska. They have a launch site out there. And then also Kwajalein, which is in the middle of the Pacific. So that one, if you get to go there, it's great if you like to scuba dive, and look forward to long plane rides.
There's also one in the Caribbean that ESA uses, I believe.
So ESA launches from, so those, I mentioned the ones that Launch Services in particular works with. But once you start getting around the world, then you're opening yourself up to many different launch sites. And also another one where we work with is there's a New Zealand site that is a FAA sanctioned site. And so we have had launches from there. So that it's still considered a US rocket.
Is that the same one that Rocket Lab uses?
That's Rocket Lab, yes. So we have a venture class launch service contract with them. But yeah, so the European Space Agency, the Ariane rocket launches out of French Guiana, which is in South America. And so multiple continents have had it. So when it comes to launch sites, you are looking for a place where you're launching and can launch over water, or somewhere that's, or sometimes people will also, different sites will use deserts, because public safety is a big thing with launch. You want to be able to launch, and if something goes wrong, as much as we try not to, we also have to plan for things going wrong. NASA has lots of plans for things going wrong, for contingencies. And so we want to try and have there to be as little endangerment as possible when those failures do happen.
So is there like an international database or schedule where all these countries and these agencies that are launching all the time can keep track of? Because I imagine you can't have like 2 or 3 launches at the same time in the world, because I mean, is there a chance that these trajectories might cross? And I mean, do you guys have to keep in check other people's schedules and just make sure there's enough space for all the rockets that are going up?
So we don't, we don't really do that. So you do have to, the space station, when you launch the space station, which for orbit purposes, from just like a physical with our rockets point of view, you can pretty much get there every single day of the year from any place that you'd be launching on the world. But for operational reasons, yes, we have very heavy scheduling that we'll do with Russia or Japan or Europe, depending on which vehicles are actively going to the space station, and make sure that they're not coming up at the same time. But no, we have days where we have multiple rockets around the world launching. It's not something that I know of where there's an organization that's keeping track. Journalists will keep track. And so lots of times we'll know about other stuff. Now, again, countries, not everyone announces all their launches, but the nice thing for us is space is very big. And so if you're launching from disparate points of the world and you're going to different destinations, with the exception of the space station, that's really the only time that you're really going to the exact same kind of place. It's not too much of a danger. It's kind of the same thing with the orbital debris. It is possible if when we're launching something that we might hit something on the way up, but it's a very short period of time that we're anywhere near stuff. So we do have things where we'll really look out for if there's anything where humans are on board. Those spacecraft will really be sure that we're not going, within anywhere of a certain bubble, or that even for, a certain number of hours afterwards, because the space station and other vehicles with humans has to move out of the way if something were to go wrong, like, on the way up, if we were to cross and then have an accident, we want to make sure that we weren't in a place where they'd have to likely move around. So we're very cautious with them, but otherwise space is really big. And so for something that's launching from the Earth, it's not too big of an issue. So even we have, I don't believe we had any Mars missions. I'm not sure if we've ever had any missions launching to Mars on the same day from different points of the world, but it's highly unlikely they'd be taking the exact same path or really cross each other, even though they were going towards the same destination.
So what are some of the factors that you guys take into account when you are designing or preparing or setting up the trajectory for a rocket? I imagine there's weather, there's what your destination is, everything from, I don't know, maybe the way that the Earth is located, and if you have to go polar or across, how do you guys decide what trajectory is the right one, and what factors do you need to take into account?
So there's a lot of factors. So weather tends to be one that we don't really consider until you're getting closer to launch. So when it comes to designing years ahead of time, you're really looking much more at the orbit. And so you're kind of saying, where am I going? So one of the factors might be what inclination do I need to get to my final orbit. And so inclination is something where if you can imagine, a piece of paper and you turn it at different, if you had a globe and you turn it at different angles. And so a polar orbit is one where your orbit would go from the North Pole and then over the South Pole. And so that's a 90-degree orbit approximately. But an equatorial orbit is one if you're going from the west to the east and you were just staying above the equator, you're at 0 degrees. And so then there's all kinds of grades in between there. So that's a pretty big factor that really kind of determines the path that you're going to take from a launch site. So that you'll think of that and say, well, what are launch sites that make sense? With, again, that range safety point of view, what are the directions I can safely launch? And so that kind of gives you an idea of which inclinations you can get to. Now you can make some of these corrections up in space, but then that costs a lot of fuel. And we're always trying to figure out what we can do to not use, to save fuel as much as possible.
So does wind direction play a role?
So that'll be a factor on launch day. So the weather tends to be a factor of, some of it is just conditions like lightning and certain kinds of clouds that we just say, you know what, that's not a safe condition to launch. And so we'll just say, no, we're not launching. Mm-hmm. Wind is among them, where we'll have sensors on the ground, and depending on the rocket, we know how well it can power through different types of winds. Mm-hmm. So we'll look at the winds and see if these are ones we can work with. And one thing that is a change we've made over the decades, so in the early days we didn't have this, but we added this around I think it was around the early 70s, that we started having the ability to have the rocket change its path slightly due to and take into account the current winds. And so we'll make very small tweaks that'll happen so that the path will be changing to be the best one given the wind conditions. Again, if they're in such a state that we can still fly through them. Some days we can't fly through that. We just say, you know what, if we do that, we're taking too big a risk that we're not willing to. The way that we can fly that, the conditions, they all vary based on not just the rocket. So whether you're on a Pegasus or a Falcon 9 or an Atlas 5, but which type. An Atlas 5 can have no solids or 5 solid rocket boosters. Those are very different wind conditions, depending on what the format of the rocket is.
Does the weight of the payload or the spacecraft it's holding or ushering into space, is that a factor for your trajectory as well?
It's such a the rocket is so much bigger that's really not a factor. Mm-hmm. It could have a factor with things like if we have a nuclear payload, because there's a whole bunch of safety different types of safety measures we take into account when there is a nuclear payload on. So the winds, that could be a different kind of factor for nuclear, but the size of the payload is it's such a small fraction of the overall vehicle that's not very much of a big deal.
So we just had a big launch to Mars. The latest rover, Mars 2020, is heading to Mars right now. And some people aren't aware, or they couldn't understand why it was so important for you guys to meet the deadline, because there's only a certain window of opportunity because of the location of Mars and all that for us to launch. Like if we would have missed this deadline last month, we would have had to wait, about 2 years to be able to launch to Mars again, right? Could you explain a little bit to the audience why that is?
Yeah, so the way that it works is we have the Earth going around the sun. And so Mars, we're the third planet from the sun, Mars is the fourth. And their orbit takes them about twice as long as the Earth to go around. And so the reason it's every 26 months is, so for rockets, anytime you're going to place, if I had a rocket with infinite propellant, I could launch any day I wanted, and and depending on how strong I could make my rocket on paper, I could get there, at any time length. But we have to work with real rockets that currently exist, that we have factories that can put out, and we can put on a launch pad. And so with our current technology, So the most optimal time that takes kind of the least amount of propellant with our chemical rockets, because we also want to take into account we don't want it to be up in space for long periods of time because things can go wrong. Because there's all kinds of ways you can do it with different types of engines on the spacecraft, but then maybe you're taking a really long time to get there, so then your technology is getting outdated and you just have breakages that can happen. But what happens is, so when Mars is going around that big cycle that's twice the size of ours, we kind of look for a point where the Earth is just behind it, and we're coming up, and then we're passing it, and that's a good time because basically we're kind of going in the same directions. We're on the same side of the sun as Mars usually, and we're kind of coming up on it, and so that's a good time to launch a spacecraft towards it. Because a big thing that we're trying to do when we launch to Mars is we have to go and aim for where Mars is going to be. And so we're looking for a journey that's kind of the least amount of fuel from the day that we launch it to when it will actually arrive at Mars. So, and we have to think about so that's kind of tells you when the basic launch period is. So the launch period are the sets of days we can launch. And for a lot of times for Mars missions, it's close to a month. Sometimes for different mission reasons, it might be a little shorter, it might be a little longer, but it's usually around a month. And so those orbits determine the basic time frame around when that will happen. But then there's other factors that'll actually get it down to even the real set of days that'll fluctuate. And so we'll have to take into account how fast the spacecraft is going when it's reaching Mars. Because just so like if you're doing an egg toss, you can throw it to your friend who's really far away, but if that explodes in their hand, it doesn't do you much good. So we want to make sure that the spacecraft can adequately slow down. They have dust storms on Mars, and sometimes they're localized. Sometimes they can take up the entire planet. So we try to avoid, there's seasons on the planet Mars. So we don't want to be arriving, if we can avoid it, during those dust storms. It's not very ideal for having a safe landing and doing checkout of the spacecraft if it's landing on the surface. If it's in orbit around Mars, then it's less of a big deal.
Wow, so there's a lot of things that have to be perfectly aligned for a successful launch and landing at another planet, huh?
Yeah, and then it's funny saying perfectly aligned. It's more like we're trying to get it where it's a lot of what we do is it's optimization. It's trying to find a sweet spot where as many factors as possible are in the good range. Because lots of times, you can make something like, oh, this is the time of year that's the perfect weather on Mars, but then the 26-month period doesn't line up with that at all. And we also have communication satellites around Mars, and so we can communicate directly from the Earth at a lower bit rate to satellites. This is particularly for landings, because we want to make sure that as it's coming in and doing its approach, we can get as much information so that if something goes wrong, we know what it is so that maybe we can fix it. And if we can't, then at least we know better for next time. Or even if something goes right, but guess what? It didn't go perfectly right. There are some things we could improve on for the future. Having that data is invaluable because we only go to Mars so often. So anything we can do to optimize it's better. So yeah, those satellites, we're often just trying to get what's kind of good enough between everything.
So do you have a favorite rocket?
It's like asking who my favorite child or my favorite dog I've ever had is. They're all different and have the things you love about them and the things that drive you a little crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So yeah, no, I have a lot of respect for them. You could say the one that I have, Atlas 5 is the one that I kind of really had my first Mars mission on and did my most in-depth work early on. So it's always going to have like a nostalgia factor for me to work with. Is maybe the closest I could get, but they bring great, wonderful things with them, and then also things that just drive you a little nuts too.
So how have you all managed to keep up with this launch schedule amongst a pandemic? I know NASA's been, they're really good at quarantining and keeping things clean. Has anything really changed, or this is like not your first rodeo type of thing?
So in some ways, yeah, we have, we're taking the needed steps to protect and care for the NASA team, which is critical to the success of our missions. And that is something that we are always doing because safety is a core value at NASA. So, we're monitoring the situation and we're remaining open as we adjust our operations. So there are ones that we've identified, as the essential missions. For example, the Demo 2 mission, launching humans to the ISS, and the March 2020 are just an example of some of them that are coming up. So by assigning things as essential activities, that allows us to determine what are the on-site ones that need to happen. And so those are things like preparing for upcoming launches to the space station, for work continuing. So we're continuing the leadership is monitoring and making adjustments as appropriate. So for me personally, I'm an analyst. So I enjoy visiting the hardware and seeing how things go together, but that's not required to really do my job. Understanding it can be useful and helpful as an overall, but day-to-day touching hardware or being on site isn't essential. So I'm able to get all of my essential work done through my computer using the computer programs. And it's really wonderful how many networking tools that we have, and virtual reality, and being able to have video meetings. I do, and not everything is there. There are things that you get just by overhearing a conversation. But overall, really, the core work is able to be done for me and for many people throughout the space center. So it's really great.
That's great to hear. And now you're ramping up for the next, for the Crew 1 mission, right? That's heading over to the space station in October, is it?
Yeah, I would have to actually check on that. So the commercial crew program, which the launch services program gives support to. So we're part of their engineering teams that help them, because we're really good at knowing the rockets. They're doing a lot of other things we're not. And so they're working the Crew 1 mission. And that's one of the ones that NASA's got coming up that is on our essential activities list.
So has being an aerospace engineer or working in space always been something that you've wanted to do?
Yeah, actually, sometimes I'm surprised at how consistent I've been since I was about 16. So, I first dreamt of being an astronaut and really started to fall in love with space when I was around 6 years old. There's a movie Space Camp that I loved and watched over and over again as a 6-year-old. And we also had a really wonderful
I remember that one.
Yeah, I got to meet Leah Thompson a couple of years ago. She was at an event in Florida, and so it was very fun. I was like, that movie was really inspirational for me. So it was a fun activity to do, because I loved it. It's very fun watching it as an adult, and it takes place, some at Kennedy Space Center. And
yeah.
So, we're like any other profession where you watch movies that are about your field and you kind of like, oh, boy, that's not how things work. But it can be quite enjoyable too, even if things are very different than real life. But yeah,
talking about meeting people, have you met everyone you've wanted to meet? Is there like a role model or somebody that you look up to that you would love to meet one day and have a conversation and maybe ask them a few questions?
So yeah, it is one thing where I get to meet a lot of interesting people all through the space industry. I recently watched a movie, I believe it's Radium, on Marie Curie, and so it was really interesting to just to see someone who's so dedicated to the science. It would have been wonderful to kind of talk with her and just see how she processed it through a lot of challenges. But it's funny to think about. Also, I have a lot of friends who, it's amazing, they're so dedicated to finding the science and just continuing to ask questions, which is kind of different than I am as an engineer. I'm an engineer. My focus is on solving problems. That's my happy space. But it's fascinating to me, the people who are just out there kind of questioning. So there are some people, like I follow on Twitter, like Katie Mack, who I have her book, The End of Everything, that it's I'd love to sit down and have a meal with or something. They're kind of fun, because I really enjoy how different scientists think than I do as an engineer.
Did you, when you saw the Marie Curie show, did you see any differences as a woman, as a female, being in STEM, what she had to her challenges back then versus today, you being an engineer, because it is an area where it's still a little bit predominantly male in some cases.
Yeah.
Did you see any differences, or it kind of pointed things out to you that's like, wow, things have changed, or maybe not?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, luckily, that's far enough back that things have changed quite dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Where it is allowed. Nothing else. It's nice that there are a lot of legal things that prevent the discrimination. But
Right.
also, I mean, most of the people that I work with and encounter are kind of encouraging. There's things where people struggle because there are changes,
Mm-hmm.
and some of those changes benefit, all the sexes, not just females. And so, but it's just change that comes when you start to really incorporate another group that was kind of excluded for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, and I mean, she also had to really struggle with being a pioneer herself in a lot of ways, versus I have a lot of leaders that I can look that came the generation ahead of me.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes even further, they have people that they looked up to. And so, I mean, that's one thing that's kind of different for me versus the ones who are one or two generations above me, is that I have so many more examples. There's so much more incorporation. So it's still, the challenges are still there,
Mm-hmm.
but they're dramatically reduced compared to what it was back then. And in there, speaking of people who are active on social media, and this is something, of course, people who do for NASA, it's our choice if we are for our personal lives, but there's no way around the people that I see in science who are women get attacked much more. And so that's something Curie also dealt with.
Do you have any advice for young girls that are interested in going to STEM or becoming engineers and going into the career soon?
Yeah, I think a big thing is, figure out what you're interested in, but also building your support groups is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is true for everyone, but I think, it can be very helpful for times when, if you're looking around and not seeing as many people that look like you, finding those support groups, whether they're near or far.
Mm-hmm.
So, I appreciate the Twitter community. I've always, been able to find them in different places, but sometimes I struggled with how much to talk about, the problems I struggled with for things like imposter syndrome, where you feel like everyone around you is just amazing.
I experience the same thing.
It's a very common one, among people who are working in high achieving fields. Many people
Yeah,
suffer.
everybody's an overachiever.
Yeah, but we all feel a bit diminished by the fact that the people we were around are so great, even if they're struggling the same doubts.
Right.
And so, I did both in undergrad and graduate school have really good, groups that I could talk to. But sometimes you might want to find people outside of that. I joined the Society of Women Engineers. And so here locally,
I've heard that's a good one.
Yeah, to have women who don't work for NASA, but are struggling with some of the same problems,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of relate to. And, for everyone also, considering your mental health, executives, pro athletes, everyone it's important to have that support system and be doing checks, because it gets worse as you go on. So the more that you can correct things earlier, or just have that support system for if you're in a kind of a lower place or really struggling with something high functioning, the better. It's something that keeps you operating at a high level. So those are some of the things that, will help you get through if you do encounter those challenges.
So what does the future hold for Caley?
Oh, so the future.
Are you going to apply to be an astronaut?
I do apply to be an astronaut. So I know, it's not, a high dream of mine, or one that I think is terribly realistic at this point, but I do put in that application. It's fun to do, to just fill out and keep that dream a little alive. But I'm still really just enjoying working for the Launch Services Program, because I really love that I get to work with multiple rockets, and at a given time, I get to see across the field of what's going on in definitely the US rocket market, and then at times even the foreign one, and then to get to see a huge variety of spacecraft. They're going off to all these places. So I may only personally be working 2 or 3 at a time, and I'll be on them maybe somewhere between 2 to 4 years each. But then I get to hear about them my coworkers are working on. So March 2020, I was not personally assigned that mission, but I was in meetings where we would talk about Mars 2020, we'd evaluate it. And I had worked on Mars Science Lab and InSight, the 2 previous NASA Mars landing missions. So I was there to give help along with everyone else on my team. And so it's wonderful to have that variety. So I'm enjoying my current spot. I still have a couple decades left in my career, but I went over and worked for the commercial crew program for about 8 months. And so that was purposely only supposed to be a short-term assignment. And it was really great getting to see kind of a different world, working with human spacecraft, trying out a different kind of job for a bit. But I was also happy to come back and keep doing what I'm doing right now.
It's certainly exciting times. I mean, you've got boosters returning to Earth and landing back on land or on boats or barges out in the ocean. And like you said, there's new innovative ideas and projects to make rockets more efficient, better, faster. So there are certainly exciting times ahead.
Yeah, and new companies come up, and we, or they develop new rockets, or the United Launch Alliance is developing the Vulcan. We weren't working with Rocket Lab 6 years ago or so. And there are others that are on the horizon. So yeah, it's an interesting time as we have new things coming up.
So if there are ever any visitors to Florida on the way to Kennedy Space Center, the Kennedy Space Center website, they do have the launch schedule there. Like if they're interested in maybe catching a launch if they happen to be in the area.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out that NASA schedule. I will say though, to check with other space journalists, there's many, because the NASA schedule only has NASA launches. And we do have commercial and military ones that come out of Florida too.
I've heard space.com is a good one.
Yeah, that's among them. And a lot of people will check Spaceflight Now. So there's a whole variety of them. Honestly, sometimes like Twitter, I follow a bot that just posts whatever rocket's launching next in the world that's going to an orbital launch one. So it's wonderful how many people are out there following it. But if you're staying in a hotel, check with the front desk. They'll tell you. They do a pretty good job of trying to at least know which ones are coming up, and then you can start checking the websites to see if what's the exact time it's going, and is it getting scrubbed, or is it actually still on target to go?
And where can folks follow you on social media?
So for the Launch Services Program, you can follow us on Twitter at NASA_LSP. We also have Facebook. And then there's NASA Kennedy is the Twitter account, and they also have Facebook and YouTube. I personally am at Rocket Caley. So Rocket, and then Caley is CALEY. And that's my personal account. It's not a government one.
Okay, excellent. Well, this has been great. I'm so happy we finally got to talk about rockets. They are certainly fascinating, and I'm pretty sure there's so much more techie stuff we could have talked about for hours.
Yeah, I joke it's my party trick, and sometimes depending on the audience, sometimes it's a wonderful party trick. They want to go into all the detail, and some people it's like, nope, this is when you have to read the face and just step back. And luckily, I have many other interests that aren't rockets.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Caley, and I hope you have a nice weekend.
Thanks, you too. It was lovely, Anna.
Thank you for tuning in to the ideaXme show. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Check out this episode's description for links and info to sources discussed on the show. Have a great day, everyone. Until next time.